Hello again, and welcome to our second section of this first unit of our course. I will just start by sharing my presentation with you. There we go. Okay. So let's now continue with the second section of this foundational unit of our course on la ficción narrativa y la transformación social de los relatos medievales al storytelling actual. As you might remember, I'm Liliana Aristimuño, and as I said at the very end of my first section and my first video, you can contact me with comments or questions to any of these by email to any of these accounts that you see at the bottom of this slide. Now, in this section, we will be focusing on a key function of narratives and storytelling, and a topic really dear to my heart, which is that of the emotional function, the expression of emotion in storytelling, and how the storytellers use different resources to fulfill this function using verbal, that is to say, words, and non-verbal resources. In our case, we'll be focusing on vocal and facial resources. Now, on our first video, we mentioned that the expression of emotion was an essential part of narratives and thus storytelling, which is defined here as an oral performance of an individual interpretation of a narrative text. Now, sharing these culturally accepted values, attitudes, and emotions and ideologies can be interpreted as the emotional function of narratives, which is the focus of our presentation of this second section. Now, attitudinal meanings, including affective or emotional meanings, are therefore key or strategic meanings in narratives and storytelling, because in order to effectively interpret and produce stories, storytellers have to develop empathy. That is to say, they need to interpret emotion that is experienced by the characters, either expressed explicitly or implicitly in the text. They also have to be able to associate characters' emotions to the key events in the narrative, in the reactions that these characters have to different experiences and different events. They also need to be able to interpret explicit or implicit judgments of behavior which are more or less bound to culture and cultural values. They need as well to be able to identify the triggers and the sources of emotions. So what objects or situations make characters react? Appreciate objects and phenomena, as well as what are the judgments of people in the text. Finally, they need to be able to shunt, to shift, to move between these concrete experiences that are narrated in the story plot and the more abstract, deeper meanings that are inscribed in the text, that are there for the skillful reader or audiences to unbury, which will be the key of our last section. Now, how can we interpret and produce these meanings? SFL offers us some tools to interpret these meanings by identifying the affectual language that the SFL mapped in the storytelling using the appraisal system. There's a lot of literature on the appraisal system, but one of the first sources is Martin and White, 2005, and I invite you to have a look at it, especially at chapter 2, if you're interested. And I've also included here a paper by Teresa Oteiza and Claudio Pinuer, which also has a Spanish version or translation and research done on appraisal. Now, when we apply these SFL tools to storytelling, however, we can't only describe the verbal resources, the verbiage that is the focus of Martin and White and Oteisa's paper, Oteiza-Binua's paper. But we also need to interpret and, if we want, be able to produce affectual meanings multimodally, multisemiotically. Now, to account for this multimodal expression of emotion, what I consider was the contribution for my work in my thesis was the contribution of each semiotic resource and how these resources contribute and cooperate together to create the affectual meanings in storytelling. So what I suggest is that we can start by looking at the verbiage, the verbal resource, and we can do this by looking at both the discourse semantic and the lexicogrammatical features as suggested by Martin and White. And then we can listen to the meanings, trying to listen for meaning, interpreting the vocal features that color the text with emotion. We can then focus on the facial expression and, if we can as well, on the postures that the storytellers are adopting and performing so that they can enact these different emotions. And to finally, once each semiotic resource has been explored and described independently, we can describe the ensemble, the multimodal or the multisemiotic ensemble in relation to a very clear context. We remember that we are in this model of language that includes the context, in this case, storytelling, and also looking at a very specific instance, in my case, for my thesis, the story of Cinderella, so that in this way we can see how these resources create, show, clarify affectual meanings. I will now share a very brief overview of this toolkit, which we can use for each of the semiotic resources. So, a complete picture of the SFL tool I have used to describe emotions in storyteller can give us the possibility of talking about, for example, whether the emotions are positive or negative, at the same time of talking about 4 main categories. A prospective, that is to say, something yet to occur kind of category, such as the one we have here, disinclination. So disinclination and inclination, if we're talking about the positive case. And 3 circumspective groups, which are related to something that is already in existence. So in here we have, sorry about that, going crazy with the presentation. We have the categories of happiness and unhappiness, security and insecurity, and satisfaction and dissatisfaction. And we can see here that we can gloss these choices even further into desire, fear, cheer, misery, affection, antipathy, confidence, disquiet, trust, perturbance, interest, ennui, pleasure, and displeasure. So it gives us a very, very thorough tool to describe emotion. However, as useful as this very detailed system can be, it can be a little bit overwhelming. So we can always simplify the categories that we use by focusing, for example, on 3 main affect types, as we have, for example, in this case, proposed by Rabianca, and where we have matters of the heart, happiness and unhappiness, pursuit of goals, satisfaction and dissatisfaction, and another group focusing on social well-being, security, insecurity. A strong point about this discourse semantic perspective is that it allows us to interpret the different verbal or lexicogrammatical resources that are used to show these meanings and for the same meaning. So, for example, we all know that the speakers can choose to express emotion in a very wide variety of lexicogrammatical choices. Now, Some of these resources describe emotions more explicitly, as for example, if we say she was sad or happy, or happily, surprisingly. So these qualities or adjectives are at the top of this line that we can propose to show how we can tell our listeners in a very explicit, so less explicit way, that implies that they are going to be to do less inferring, on their part. They're going to be inferencing less because we're very explicit as to the emotion that we're feeling or that the character is feeling. Now, however, there are some other resources that, rather than telling the audience how characters or ourselves or the storyteller feels, show the audience how these characters or the storyteller feels. And in this way, the audience has to do a little bit more inferencing to unpack, to unbury the meanings, the emotional meanings. So we can place this in a line that goes from something less implicit to something more implicit, where we show emotion. For example, by means of repeating an experience. So the girl had to do all the work, all the cooking, all the cleaning, all the washing. That creates a certain emotion, shows a certain emotion that we have to do as audience a little bit more to kind of decide which kind of emotion that is. Now, the words the storyteller chooses to express emotions are uttered in a certain way that also express affectual meanings. So that also expresses affectual meanings. Even though we can usually hear and perceive the differences in meaning, it tends to be more difficult to name. What is it that we perceive? What are the changes in the vocal qualities that have allowed us to interpret or to think that the person or the character is sharing a different emotion? Now, some of the features that we can play with are prosodies, that is to say, the choices that the speakers make in terms of the pitch they use, the tempo, the loudness, precision, prominence, transition. And I'm really sorry I won't be able to show you examples of this or to go into detail, but please contact me if you are interested in these categories. The voice qualities that they choose, so the speakers can make changes in relation to how they, change the posture of the organs of speech. Rests, that is to say, the moments in between the tone units. So this is a little bit specific. So how do we break the information into bits, and what happens in between? Do we have hesitation? Do we have silence? Do we have some other kind of noise? And then the voice qualifications, that is to say, this optional phenomena that runs through or interrupts the speech, such as laughter, for example. Now, it is important for us to know that these features are only meaningful when they are interpreted in a certain context, and they are considered as a bundle selected over another bundle that projects affectual meanings in conjunction, so not separate, but in conjunction with what we can perceive and interpret from the wordings and the facial expressions if they are available. So an example for you to hear where we can see these features working together comes from this storyteller, and I'm going to invite you to hear.
But she had no mother because the rich man's wife had died.
So even though we do not have here any explicit mention of any kind, of the emotion that Cinderella is feeling and that the storyteller is performing for Cinderella, we can very well hear a profile for affect that is showing misery. Now, all of these features that I just shown you can be a little bit overwhelming to consider, but we can always select a few that we feel are going to be the most relevant for our purposes, and we can scaffold them, some of them, and reflect on the main differences that they have between, for example, two key emotions here, like cheer and misery, and see why is it that we perceive in the voice these clear differences, because maybe they have this clear selection of opposites, for example, yeah, like in the case of pitch height, that is high and mid, to when we want to, when we're expressing joy and cheer, but maybe low when we are showing misery, for example. Now, let's move to facial expressions. Now, when we're talking about facial expressions, once again, we can choose from a variety of facial resources and semiosis. That, once again, in the case of storytelling, they are always cooperating with language and vocal features. They can be described, and I'm not going to go into detail here, but we can talk about facial configurations in terms of the different configurations and the different motions or movements that are adopted by the face. And we can describe them thinking about what happens in the forehead, the eyebrows, the eyes, the nose, the cheeks, the mouth, the jaw, yeah, and how all of these features work together so that we interpret different emotions. So, for example, here we've got the emotion resources in facial configurations for misery and for cheer, coming from my thesis, where we see that there is, again, choices that in their opposition create meaning as a bundle. Okay, moving on now to putting all of these together so that we can interpret the multimodal ensemble. How words, the voice and the face work together to create meanings with a particular example. So here we have a bit of text, comes from two storytellers that perform the same extract, where we know the stepsisters are telling Cinderella that she can't go to the ball because she lacks the proper clothing, or, you know, that she's dirty, and all those things that we know about the story. Now, when we read these two extracts, we can see that the stepsisters are telling Cinderella that the people, everyone, will probably laugh at her if she goes to the ball as she is. So we can interpret this using the system of affect, and we can consider laugh at or laugh as an instance of antipathy, showing dislike, because the people and everybody is mocking Cinderella. They are laughing at her and not with her. So we can represent this saying that the character Cinderella is coupled with a certain emotion, in this case, antipathy, and that we can see that the appraiser, the people that are sharing this emotion are people in this case, and everybody in the other case. Now, what happens when we include the voice and the face to see that how this that these affectual meanings can be much more complex and help us to identify affectual stances and alliances. So in this instance, for example, we see how the storyteller uses the voice. The voice of the stepsisters, not his own, although he is performing the stepsisters, to show a different stance with a different affectual meaning than the one that is portrayed in the verbiage for the people. So we said before that the people thought didn't like Cinderella and they were going to laugh at her. Now, in the case of, sorry about that, in the case of this, the voice that this storyteller chooses for the stepsisters, he has a choice. He can present the stepsisters as mocking Cinderella, showing their dislike, with the stepsisters showing for vocal and facial resources to show this, or something else rather than dislike. So let's have a look and see what our interpretation of
And the
this can be.
stepsisters turned to it and said, "But anyhow, Cinderella, you don't have a dress, and you can't go like that. Better you stay here than have people laugh at you."
So we see here that by looking at this multimodal analysis, we can see that the storyteller is not showing antipathy, but rather misery, both in the vocal profile for affect and in the facial affect that he is portraying. So we see that he is showing the stepsisters as aligning with Cinderella, showing an alliance with Cinderella in this pity that they show for her, rather than showing an alliance with the people at the party who show antipathy towards Cinderella. Now, what happens with this other example, this other instance where we have very similar language, very similar verbiage, but different facial and vocal features selected by the storyteller? Let's have a look and see.
As if you could go to the ball. Oh, you in your dirty clothes and your dirty face. Oh, everybody could just laugh, Cinderella, laugh. Oh, no, you could never go to a ball.
So in this case, we see that the stepsisters are being portrayed by the storyteller as sharing this contempt towards Cinderella as everybody else in the party. This is key for us to uncover these affectual stances and alliances. Now, with this, we finish this section of the emotion in storytelling by having looked at both verbal and nonverbal resources. And we can see how this multimodal ensemble is used by the storytellers, not only to align with some characters, but also to disalign, to show a different stance of characters and themselves. Okay, these are the references that I've used for this section. Once again, obrigado, gracias. Thank you so much for being here and sharing this video with me. I hope to see you in the very last one.